My name is Kate Poyer. I'm the director of the Center for Media and Communication Studies here at CEU and faculty in the Department of Public Policy and Political Sciences. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Manuel Puppis from the University of Zurich and the Institute of Mass Communication and Media Research. And he'll say much more about the project that he's going to be presenting. But we've worked together loosely, but we're very excited that you're here and working with us kind of over the next 6 months at least, and hopefully more into the future. And he's also the vice chair of the media policy division of ECRIA, the European, I never get the acronyms right.
Communication Research and Education Association.
It's the word education, and for some reason doesn't out. One of the main European network around media and communication researchers, and so there's conferences once a year, and the divisions meet every other year, and so there's also some opportunities that we'll be exploring there as well. But here today, so within the context of a lot of the different work that you do on different aspects of media policy and regulation in the European context, is this really particular study that's quite interesting to us as this bridge between these discourses around public policy and political communication. The title of which being the political communication of regulatory agencies between legitimacy management and new governance. So with that, with this project that you've got underway, I'll leave it to you. You were going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, I suppose, and then we can have some discussion and any questions and what have you. Thank you so much for being here, and Manuel's here for the next couple of days. If anyone wanted to actually connect, but certainly anyone else.
Thank you very much for having me and for coming tonight to this short presentation. Kate already said the name of my presentation today, and normally I'm someone working on media policy and regulation, and now this project comes with political communication in the title, and it is actually about political communication, but it is about regulators as well. So I'll come to that in just a minute. So this isn't a fully fledged presentation or a project we finished, but it's more or less a project that keeps me awake sometimes and I have to think about a lot. It's a 4-year research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. It's an interdisciplinary project between political science and communication science, and we're looking at regulatory agencies. And as the communication science guy in the project, I'm mostly interested in the communication, of course, of these agencies. Regulatory agencies exist in many sectors. We have here a few single regulators in the communication sectors that are responsible for both the regulation of broadcasting and telecommunications, like the one in Hungary. Of course, there are telecom regulators that are only responsible for telecommunications, and there are broadcasting regulators in various countries that are only dealing with broadcasting, which is complicated enough mostly. But the communication sector, of course, isn't what this project is about. I care a little bit more about communication regulation than about other kinds of regulation, so that is why I'm more interested in how telecom and broadcasting regulators do regarding their communications. But of course there are regulators in various other sectors, like in the energy sector or in the financial sector, where regulation didn't seem to work out that well. But we have literally in various sectors there are regulators across Europe in all different countries. And in what follows, I will first talk a little bit about regulatory agencies, what they are, how they came into being, and then focus on the topic, political communication. And I will then also, of course, try to combine the two and talk a little bit about the two kinds of communications that regulators deal with, namely legitimacy management by communication and regulation by communication. And finally, I'd like to give some overview of what lies ahead in the project we're working on. So let's first start with regulatory agencies in a nutshell. And while agencies exist in the US, of course, for a very long time, in Europe, the formation of regulatory agencies is a rather new phenomenon. But by now, regulatory agencies have become key actors of policymaking in various economic sectors. I already said that they exist in energy, in financial services, in, of course, communications, but also in health and many other economic sectors. And they were established starting in the 1980s following the liberalization of said sectors. And one can think of this liberalization as kind of a triad, consisting of privatization, deregulation, and re-regulation. First, there was a privatization of former state monopolies. Then deregulation means that competition was introduced, so private competitors were allowed to operate or start operating. And third, some new regulation was deemed necessary in order to regulate the newly established competition. So all over Europe, the responsibility for this new kind of regulation was transferred to so-called independent regulatory agencies. Whether the name rings true or not is another question. There is also a difference between formal and de facto independence. But that's actually the idea, to have an independent regulator, independent from government and independent from the industry. And of course, the communication sector was no exception. In telecommunications, the privatization of former state monopolies was the rule. It happened in all the countries. And now we have regulation that are called some public interest goals, like universal service obligation, or also, of course, to prevent the incumbent from abusing its quite significant market power. So in broadcasting, privatizations were less common. There are only a very few examples, like in France, where the public service broadcasting is actually privatized. Liberalization was limited to the authorization of private, mostly commercial broadcasting. So this resulted in so-called dual broadcasting systems, consisting of public broadcasting and private broadcasting. And as Könenburg and McQuaid put it, there was limited political wish or will to discard the existing public sector or to harm various social and cultural interests. The sacrifice of monopoly was about as far as governments would go to create space for new competitors in a media marketplace. End of quote. So we have now these regulators in the telecommunications sector, in the broadcasting sector, and in some countries in the last years they were converged to single regulators as a response to the technological changes taking place in telecommunications and broadcasting. So these regulators are new key actors in regulatory policy making. Yet what exactly is an agency? It is, in its most simple sense, a body which is organizationally separated from a ministry or from government, from the public administration. It has its own powers given under public law and hence enjoys also some form of autonomy. But it can never be fully independent, of course. After all, it's still a public body. A regulatory agency then is an agency that is responsible for regulation. What makes agencies special is that they are neither directly elected nor are they accountable to directly elected officials. So this is where the independence comes into play, why they are called independent. But this also brings some problems with it, of course. Now, the question is why governments delegate the powers to deliberately independent bodies. I mean, it's not a question why they delegate the powers to somebody they could control, but why delegate powers to a body they can't control or shouldn't be able to control. There are, of course, functional reasons brought forward for this. Efficiency, more efficient than public administration, the expertise, but this can't explain everything. So credibility was also said to be a reason for this. So governments can credibly commit themselves to a certain policy, but they can also commit future governments which might have a different opinion on matters. And also blame shifting seems to be quite an important functional reason for, well, delegating powers. So you are not the bad guy. Nevertheless, all these functional reasons can't explain why the delegation of powers really took place, because there is a lot of cross-national and also cross-sector variation in this delegation to regulatory agencies. So other explanations include path dependency and taken for grantedness coming from various kinds of new institutionalism. But what is important about agencies when we try to define them is this formal independence. But this formal independence entails a lack of legitimacy. As I said, they are neither directly elected by voters, nor are they accountable to the people who are directly elected. So, while this is, of course, an advantage to have a player that is independent of partisan pressures, it is also a problem if you look at this from a democratic point of view. But enough about regulators for the moment. I'll deal with them in a moment again, but first let's come to political communication. This project is actually about, or my part of the project is about, political science guys in the project are more interested in regulatory networks at the European level and at accountability. I'm interested in this communication aspect. And if regulatory agencies are important actors in policy making, then political communication, of course, is an important topic. Because nowadays, politics is mediated. That is a truism by now, but Mazzolini and Schulz convincingly argue that communication is a necessary prerequisite for the functioning of any political system. To quote them, input to the political system, the demands of citizens as well as their expressions of system support must be articulated by communication, channeled into the political arena by mass media and converted into system output. In a similar way, system output, that is political decisions and their actions, has to be communicated to the public, and in modern societies the mass media are essential for this function, end of quote. So this is why it is said that political communication now is mediated. It takes place in the media or via the media. But more recent political communication research even says that political communication is mediatized. Now, Sonia Livingstone noted that mediatization sounds like some clumsy neologism, and it isn't completely wrong, but on the other hand, coming out of Germanic languages, the concept seems to be accepted more and more. And it goes beyond mediation. So the media have to attain some form of autonomy, of independence from other social institutions, and they start operating according to their own media logic, not to a political logic or to the logic of churches, which they were owned by. So they have their own media logic. And the argument now is that political actors adapt to and adopt this media logic. In the first place, because of the independence of the media, they are forced to adapt to the media logic if they still want to play a role in political communication, if they want to be covered in the news. However, the media logic is still perceived to be external to the political system. But then in the second step, they adopt this media logic, so they internalize it, they really make it their own. Now, of course, it is an empirical question whether a mediatization of politics and political communication is really taking place or not. And this isn't a theoretical or conceptual question. And this is also the reason why, I also click too much, why a lot of political communication research in the last years, at least the political communication research that is not looking into media content, effects and campaigning, is interested in this question of mediatization. So it takes a more structural approach, asking how political actors are changing, how their communication is changing because the media are taking such an important place in the public arena. So here we come again to the regulators and their political communication. Despite the fact that regulators now are such key players in policy making, and despite the fact that political communication is an integral part of politics, regulatory communication marks a largely unexplored subject. In fact, there are only a few studies dealing at all with the subject. It has been neglected today by both scholars of political communication and policy sciences, but also by scholars interested in communication policy research. Well, people interested in political communication mostly deal with governments or with party communication, not with regulators. And people interested in regulation most of the time don't care about political communication. So this is actually a project that tries to bring these two views a bit together. And as I said, I'm more interested in media regulation, communication regulation than in normal economic regulation. For me, it is also some kind of merger between political communication and communication policy research. But as a consequence, there are only a few studies dealing with this subject. The first one was by Kolianese and Howard in the 1990s, and they were analyzing press releases of the US environmental protection agencies. To my knowledge, it's the only study focusing on the communication of regulators in the US. So, and it has a rather narrow focus. Then there is a study by Deacon and Monk. They are looking into quangos in the UK, and as part of that they were also looking at regulators. And there is a new paper by Christine Young that deals with the presentational management of the Australian and the British Fair Trade Commissions. So there is some attention to regulatory communication, but 3 papers in 10, 15 years isn't that much. So that isn't always encouraging when doing research, but discussions about the topic show that there is some interest, and people seem to think that this is really something that could be interesting to look into. Given the importance of regulatory agencies in policy making, this to me is also rather surprising. Until now, we don't even have descriptive data on how the communication of regulators is organized, or how they are communicating, what they are communicating about, so we don't know anything about this topic. And I think what makes this even more appealing to me is that it allows to conceptualize regulatory communication in 2 different ways. On the one hand, as for other political organizations, one can look at regulatory legitimacy, or how communication helps political actors to legitimize themselves. Parties and governments communicate because they want votes, because they want support. The same can be true for regulators, of course. But with regulators, you can also look at communication as a new form of governance. Are they using communication to regulate their respective industries? I mean, there is command and control regulation, there are incentives, but what about their communication efforts? Does this help in regulating the industries? And I want to focus on these 2 aspects of regulatory communication in the following. So, first, legitimacy management by communication. And the theoretical background for this part of the project is new institutionalism in organization studies. So regulatory agencies are viewed or conceptualized as organizations, and as Richard Scott put it once, of course he comes from organizational sociology, so he has to say this, we are only able to fully understand regulatory processes when we recognize that all the principal actors involved on both sides of the process are, in fact, organizations. And what this theory does, it shows how organizations conform to institutional environments in order to gain legitimacy, which they require for their survival. So it shifts our attention to the relationship between organizations and the environments they are embedded in. And the argument is that organizations, regulators as other organizations as well, are not organized in the most efficient way. They are organized in a way that is allegedly the normal way to do it, the best way to do it, without this being necessarily the case. So organizations receive legitimacy to the extent that their structures and practices meet allegedly appropriate ways to organize. And this is especially important for organizations like regulators that produce outputs that are very difficult to appraise. And Edelman and Suchman rightly noticed that. They say, as a consequence, that the structures and practices of regulatory organizations are mainly shaped by institutional environments in order to obtain legitimacy, and not by some efficiency requirements. So, what are institutions? Well, so here at least you see it. There are three pillars of institutions according to Scott: the cultural cognitive, the normative, and the regulative pillar. The cultural cognitive pillar of institutions refers to the way taken for granted assumptions and mutually shared understandings shape organizational structures and practices. So, organizational structures and practices have a certain way or are organized in a certain way because there are common beliefs and alternatives are simply inconceivable. And when conducting interviews, for instance with the German Press Council, I asked them, why are you handling complaints in the way you do? The answer was, there is no other way. That's the logic way of doing it. That's also how the traditional system works. So for them it was the only way of doing it. Of course there are 10 other ways you could think of to do this, but this is what taking for grantedness is about. You don't see an alternative, you do it because it's the normal way of doing it. The normative pillar of institutions stresses the importance of values and norms. So this means that certain structures and practices are implemented because of a moral obligation, because there are expectations towards this organization to do it in a certain way. And the regulative pillar of institutions directs our attention to the coercive nature of institutional pressures. So some structures and practices are implemented because non-conformity may result in sanctions. Let's try the next slide, whether it works again.
The technology is normative in its inability to follow our commands.
Well, what I said so far is a fairly deterministic view on institutions and organizations. But more recent new institutionalism, of course, also looks at the role of agency in all this. So it looks at the strategic responses of organizations to institutional pressures. Oliver, in her seminal paper, suggests 5 different strategies of organizations: acquiescence, compromise, avoidance, defiance, and manipulation. And when I mentioned this at the conference, the press ombudsman of Ireland was just laughing. I guess he knew what manipulation meant. But so this means that organizations are not just doing what's expected of them, but they might also try to influence institutional requirements or conceal what they're actually doing and have a facade of so-called appropriate ways of doing it, but on the inside they're still doing what we're always doing. So it's actually quite important to understand that organizations may attempt to create and manipulate others' perceptions of their legitimacy without really changing their behavior. But organizations are, of course, not able to respond to all institutional pillars in the same ways. Taking for grantedness, by definition, means that you can't respond strategically to it, but you can respond to the normative and the regulative pillar of institutions. Now you might wonder by now what this has to do with political communication, and I hope that this explains it. Communication plays an important role in responding to institutional environments. As Julia Black put it, accountability relationships are a critical element in the construction and contestation of legitimacy claims. And accountability is closely connected to communication. So rendering account, gaining legitimacy is actually an act of communication. And this means that regulatory communication is at the same time influenced by institutional environments, but also a strategic device used to manipulate perceptions of others of a regulator's activities and performance. And here, previous research in organizational communication and also in political communication that is focusing on organizations is quite helpful. Lemerson and Barbour discuss how organizations, with their communication, try to influence their institutional environments. And Donges, focusing on parties and governments, looks at how mediatization, conceptualized as part of the institutional environment, influences the communication of parties and governments. So the media are part of the institutional environment, and the pressures they put on the organizations is seen as the mediatization I talked of earlier. To sum up this part, it can be argued that institutional environments, including the media, affect communication structures, practices, and also the content of communication of regulators through regulative pressures, normative expectations, and taken for granted assumptions. But at the same time, regulators, through their communication structures, practices, and content, may try to influence their environments and shape what people and other organizations think about them. So it might be a strategic attempt to enhance their legitimacy. But let's briefly talk about the other aspect of regulatory communication I'm interested in, and that is regulation by communication. As we know, and this comes from Anglo-Saxon regulation theory as well as German control theory, governments and regulators can use different kinds of instruments to influence society. They can make use of command and control regulation, they can make use of positive and negative incentives, and of course they can use persuasion. And Julia Black called this the stick, the carrot, and the sermon. And as the daughters Giandomenico Maione argued that indirect modes of regulation like persuasion might actually be more useful in shaping society and regulating society than command and control regulation. Command and control regulation is still necessary, but it might not help in achieving all the objectives one has with regulation. Modern society is often deemed too complex for such traditional regulation to be completely successful. Be that as it may, using information as a tool of regulation has garnered some interest. And while being in the US a few weeks ago, I learned this is discussed as informational regulation, a term I haven't heard a lot in Europe. Here it is mostly discussed as regulation by information. But it shows that in political science and also in legal studies, people are thinking about this use of information to regulate industries. So this can be the provision of knowledge, it can be naming and shaming, it can also just be by raising an eyebrow and showing the industry that the regulator is concerned. Yet scholars interested in regulation mostly are not too familiar with communication studies or political communication. So they are more interested in how information changes the behavior of the industry and not in how the regulators actually communicate. So how are they using their communication to disseminate this information to the industry? And this is what I would like to focus on. So these two aspects of communication, on the one hand legitimacy management, on the other hand communication as a part of their regulatory instruments they have at their disposal. So I talked a lot about the conceptual background of the project, and actually this is what we were doing until now, at least most of it. And what are we planning for the 3 years lying ahead? As much fun as theoretical work is, I guess we have to go to the field now and actually see what we find there. So first we are actually interested in how the communication of agencies is organized, what structures and practices do they have in place, how do their communication departments look like, and how do they communicate? So what are their strategies, what instruments are used, what's the content of their press releases. And this is a fairly basic and descriptive task, of course. But given that we don't have any knowledge about this so far, we hope to gather some basic facts. And just to make some simple examples, if you look at the FCC in the US, the communication regulator, they have an Office of Media Relations. I mean, there is a whole division devoted to communication. And with Ofcom in the UK, it's the same. It's a huge organization that puts a lot of money in communication. If you look at the Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel in the French-speaking part of Belgium, well, there is one person dealing with communication, and I doubt that it's all she's doing all day. So there are huge differences in how this is organized. Another very simple example, Ofcom, the regulator for the communication sector in the UK, issued 74 press releases last year. they have a lot of other activities too. So, but their Irish counterpart, whereby they have to say they're only responsible for the telecom sector and not the broadcasting sector, issued 22 press releases. And of course, we're also looking at the content of these press releases, not just at numbers. So we're wondering, what are they talking about? Is it about their organization, to explain the regulation, to explain their decisions? Is it about the sector? Is it market data? So what is this communication about? But after this basic task of describing what they're doing and how they're organized, we are looking into the role of communication in managing the organization's legitimacy. We ask in what way structures, procedures, and content of regulatory communication represent the response to institutional environments. Are they organizing their communication in a specific way because they see a need to conform to a normal way of doing it? I mean, they could have media departments because they think media are so important we need to have this, but it might not be what they really need. It might also be that mediatization doesn't play such a big role for regulators as it does for parties, of course, or for NGOs or for governments. So mediatization may be actually out of the picture for these organizations, but we just don't know how they argue why they do it in specific ways. And third, we are interested in the question of whether regulatory communication is indeed perceived and also used as an instrument of regulation. So is regulatory communication just about rendering account and managing legitimacy, or is it also about regulating the industry? How do they see themselves? How do they see their communication themselves? Well, already underway is a quantitative survey of regulatory agencies across Europe in 3 sectors, namely broadcasting, telecommunications, and the financial sector. We will probably add the energy sector as well. And this is a so-called simple comparison that aims at revealing differences and similarities between different sectors and between different countries. So we do not aim at explaining these differences and similarities, but just at showing them. And we hope to have first results in the next month, but to be frank, some sectors like the financial sector at the moment are not too keen to inform or to fill out surveys about how they do their work. So that causes us some problems. But for the rest of the project, we will select a few countries. The UK and Switzerland are in, also Ireland and Germany, possibly Austria. The point is, from theoretical considerations alone, we would like to have Benelux or Nordic countries in this. And this would be possible, of course, to conduct interviews in English and also to do the survey, but as soon as I'm interested in their communication and I have to analyze their press releases and other material, language skills are essential, and well, they don't translate all their press releases into English, so we need either countries that do it in German, English, French, or Italian, and our past experiences with trying to do research in France are not too encouraging in trying to do that again. So it can be quite hard to get interviews in France, to say the least. Well, and we're looking into 3 aspects there. First, the status quo and the changes in the organization of their communication departments since the formation of these agencies. So we're going back, looking at documents, annual reports, brochures, and so on. This is a qualitative document analysis, which will also be complemented by interviews if we need additional data. We will do a quantitative content analysis of the press releases of these agencies, possibly going back again to their formation. It depends whether we can get all the material, whether it still exists, whether we can access it, and also whether it's too much to analyze it all. But if it's too much, we have to, well, take a sample of that. And this is something we're looking into next. And third, we try to understand why communication is organized in specific ways and what strategies there are behind the communication of these agencies. So this is actually something for qualitative document analysis and qualitative interviews. We are trying to look into documents that describe internal decisions, document these decisions. We're trying to conduct interviews with the heads of communication departments. And here we can build up on previous research on press councils in Europe, but we also used similar methods. So to conclude, I took more than 30 minutes by now. We hope to continue to both our knowledge about regulators and to theory development. So we also have this goal of adding something on the conceptual level to both new institutionalism and to regulation theory by refining on how we think about regulators and their communication. In addition, we think the project helps to generate knowledge about the subject that has so far only attracted minor attention. So this basic data about communication by regulatory agencies, in our view, is quite important to understand what these regulators are actually doing, how they are influencing politics, how they are influencing the industry. And we hope to better understand why regulators organize themselves in specific ways, why they communicate in specific ways, and what the intent is behind that. And so we hope to extend political communication research beyond the traditional political actors, but beyond governments and parties and NGOs, and also to add to existing research on regulation and specifically to communication regulation. And now I'm open to your comments and suggestions. Thank you very much.
I have a question. I had an impression that one agency seems to communicate or regulate very much by communication, the central bank. Whether they communicate or not, or how they communicate. Alan Greenspan is probably one of the more interesting cases, communication, regulation by communication. Do you have any already some, or do you agree with me? Is it an example of that? And are there similar cases in other industries?
First of all, yes, I agree that, of course, the Federal Reserve in the US is a special example of that, and perhaps also because of the person of Alan Greenspan. But I will make a distinction between central banks and normal regulators. So central banks have a different function. They are not the ones overseeing the industry like a financial securities authority would be. So there is a difference. It is also an agency in that they are similar, but it's not a regulatory agency. There is actually a study on the communication of central banks. I don't remember the author, but somebody was actually looking into some central banks in Europe, so that could be interesting. Looking at regulators, there are some best practice examples. Some are, sometimes it's just circumstantial how this happens. I just talked to Christina before that, and she said that the Bosnian regulator for the broadcasting sector is actually quite active in their regulation, what they're doing, and I think this has a lot to do with the persons behind that and also consulting them. So I guess you find examples in countries where you wouldn't expect it, because if you don't have a lot of money, communication isn't the first thing you're thinking of. And then you have the cases of Ofcom in the UK and other British regulators which have a lot of funding, at least at the moment. This is supposedly going to change. And they are very professional in their media relations. So they have huge departments for media relations, for press relations, for public affairs. So I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes.
Okay. Well, an interesting follow-up. Well, the follow-up was interesting, but interesting point that you made that I wanted to follow up on. When you mentioned Ofcom, in particular, I'm thinking of this, and I'm wondering. I know that there's a limit to what the scope of any project can do, but one thing I'm wondering is if you're narrowing the scope of what you mean by political communications to the much more structural modes like press releases, like offices of communication. And I think about Ofcom, where they have an Office of International Affairs or International Relations or what have you, which in a way is about PR. It is about public relations because, right, I know it's a different kind of communication, but it is political communication, if not to its domestic audience, certainly about, you know, creating an army of people that are the evangelicists for Ofcom and you know, spread the good word, say, around the world, and are also working with other agencies in developing their structures and regulations and whatnot. So maybe it goes too far, and maybe it's way off the scope, but I thought it was interesting that maybe in some way, or to ask how you're dealing with other kinds of things that could be in the largest catchment considered political communications, but wouldn't show up in some of the ways in which you rightly, you know, need to focus on for this kind of study.
Well, first of all, if you talking about their international relations and they're spreading the model of Ofcom, I think it's interesting to know that they are modeled on the Italian regulator, something you would never expect, at least in the broadcasting field. But then again, I think international relations is out of scope for us, and because they also have public affairs on a national level, these regulators. I mean, they have somehow to lobby, to influence, but not in the public domain. So this is something we can't go into. So it is interesting, yes, to also look at these other kinds of communication that are going on. We are more focused on their mediated communication somehow and how they try to communicate publicly. But actually, at our institute, someone was looking into the public affairs of parties and looking at consultant companies and how they help political actors in their public affairs. So that was quite interesting because it's also an area that is quite difficult to do research on because nobody wants to talk about this non-public part of communication. And it's rather surprising what you see there. So
you would find a lot of that here,
yeah.
for example.
Yeah. And but what came to my mind when thinking of work that was done here as well, the IndieReg project looking into the independence of regulators across Europe, because actually in Edinburgh, Monroe suggested that it would be interesting to compare the independence of regulators and their communication strategies. And it didn't occur to me before, but actually now that there is data for the broadcasting sector on their independence, and that political scientists have done such kind of studies for a long time, but never cared for broadcasting, so we have data for other sectors as well. It would actually be interesting to see how their formal independence as measured in studies somehow connects to their communication activities. I would not have any propositions yet on what the connection would be, but I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it, and to see whether their independence really increases with professional communication.
Or independence results in more political communication because they're more transparent, say.
Yeah, right. So I wouldn't know what the connection is, but it seems interesting to think about.
Just to follow up and also to specify a little bit more the scope of what you mean by political communication, would you also look at for example, in telecoms, where they have the obligation to consult interagency and then to consult with the kind of commission? So would you look at this type of communication, or you would also exclude that?
No. Well, when we talk about political communication, first, I think it's important to see that a lot of research is only based on content, on effects, on reception of political communication, and how this somehow changes voting behavior in the end. So that is the main part of political communication research. Certainly that's not what we are interested in the project. So we're focusing on the actors actually communicating, of course, but not parties and governments, so regulators. And this is, well, a niche, and within that we try to look into the public communication. So not what's going on interagency.
But this is public also, like, it has to be publicized.
It is, but it's not their media relations to say.
Okay.
So that's why we're not too interested in that. But what we're looking into, or try to look into, or at least cover a bit, is their internal communication. Whether in the agency itself, these communication departments are also responsible for communication, what they're doing towards their staff, towards their employees. So to have some idea on what they're doing. I mean, on a very basic descriptive level, we are asking what are their target groups, what are the stakeholders they're communicating with. And there, of course, we will see whether other agencies, whether the public, whether parties, governments, etc., are the most important stakeholders for them. But then when we go into depth, we want to focus on their media communication, on their mediated communication.
One of the things that I remember about that one article is it talks about how regulatory agencies are beginning to compete with each other. And so I'm curious to see if any of the research that you'll do will try to trace how the regulatory decisions of the UK, for instance, impacts Italy, or and how that kind of plays out.
That's actually part of the project, not in the communication part that I'm doing, but in another part of the project. They're looking at these European networks of regulators. So, like the broadcasting regulators are all members of EPRA, which is a very informal network. But in other economic sectors, there are very formal networks because the European Union institutionalized them and requires member states regulators to work in them, and they also can make binding decisions and implement standards EU-wide. So they are actually interested to see which regulators were the main drivers behind some standards, who learned from whom in these networks. But they try it, and regulators don't feel at ease to talk about it because nobody wants to be seen as influenced by another country. They want to appear as peers, as being the same, as having all this, one vote at the table. And of course, some have more experience or more staff and different ideas, but it's quite hard to get into this.
Just to follow up on that, actually, in Hungary, for example, and I'm sure in other neighboring countries as well, it is a good thing to refer to Western, more advanced agencies as examples. So, and that's kind of a question that I had in choosing the countries. I know language is an issue, but it seems like a major problem that you are excluding the Central Eastern European region. Specifically for that reason, because the communication of these regulatory agencies may be very different from the Western ones. And
maybe less independent.
It's much less independent, probably, or maybe. I have another question, but that's not that related. I wanted to know if there was anything specific about the political communication of media and communication regulatory agencies, as opposed to other regulatory agencies. Because there's the obvious question of they are regulating the sphere in which they are trying to communicate. So is there anything specific about that?
Well, first about the countries, and in the survey, of course, we have all the members of this regulatory network. So this goes to Azerbaijan, and I don't know all the members of EPRA for the broadcasting sector. In the telecom sectors, of course, all the members of that network, which is now BEREC at the European level. So all the EU member states are in there, accession countries as well. And then there are some countries just observing, like Switzerland and all these European countries. So they are part of the survey. So on that level, we have them. We have this basic data, and actually, the new member states and the accession countries are the ones who fill out the survey, is one sign of being to be perceived as role models or doing a good job and adhering to the standards. So, but unfortunately, some of the main countries in Western Europe, like the UK or Germany, are missing, and this doesn't then allow to show differences and similarities between these countries. And we also ask in the survey whether they have role models and stuff. So there we have it, but you are of course right for the second part, for the specialization for case studies. We don't have any Central and Eastern European countries, simply because none of us is a specialist for any of these countries, and then also for my part, for the communication part, language is an issue.
Hungarian just to
And the second question about media regulators and whether they differ in their communication. I could imagine that they do. Actually, that's what I'm especially interested in, whether there is a difference from energy regulation or financial regulation, but at the moment we just don't know. I would expect that media regulation is different, or communication of media regulators is different, just because they are more aware of what the media are on the one hand, but also on the other hand, because it is a sector where command and control regulation and state regulation is not that easy and shouldn't be. And so, they have, perhaps for them, informal tools of regulation and communication as a tool of regulation is more important than in the financial sector. Well, perhaps their more command and control regulation wouldn't be a bad idea.
My question relates to your regional aspect of it, which is about Hungary's new regulatory work, which is obviously the suffering from a crisis of legitimacy. But they did make a very big effort to, they did a PR push basically to try and legitimize themselves. But a lot of the response to that was, we want to see what they do, not what they say. So there might be, it would be interesting to know if there might be regions in which press releases or statements from those officials may not be seen as a genuine effort. And in Hungary's case, it hasn't necessarily worked. There's plenty of NGOs and civil society groups that aren't trusting what the media board is saying that they will do, or their efforts to make their decisions transparent. And it definitely, the international community can't really read the decisions that they make.
Can I just a little example? This agency, because it was under fire, they opened a blog.
Yeah.
They had a blog, or have a blog, which became a laughing stock.
Yeah.
For that specific reason, because it's so obvious what they were trying to do. And
and this is a region where
totally
press
backfired.
releases always came from the government, and it was sort of, so the tradition of that communication, I think, is quite different than maybe, I don't know, the UK. I mean, it could be.
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, in this descriptive overview, we just want to know what they are doing, without judging whether this is actually a fair account of their regulatory work, or whether what the outcome or what the outcome of these regulators actually is. So it's very difficult to say what is the outcome of regulation anyway. So, but we certainly will not confuse that with the outcome of regulation. So somebody also suggested that we also look at their decisions. But I suspect that for important decisions there will be press releases. So we can somehow cover that. And of course in the interviews, we are not interested to take it at face value what these people are saying us. So, but we are interested in a more Steinar Krale wrote this quite well in his book on interview research, that interviews are an interchange of views. So it's a constructionist view on the social science research, is looking at these interviews at something how people see their world, how they want to sell us their world, how they make sense of their own daily work, and not as necessarily the one true idea about how they are doing their job. So, and of course we have to take this distance and can't take this for granted.
Maybe a couple, one, two final questions, but one thing I was thinking, and again, this is the danger, right, of when you're presenting the, more about the methods and the structure and the framework and not the findings, we all come up with all the things that we want to see in the study like it's not possible. So adding to that list, one of the things I think would be really interesting is what's not communicated. And that goes back to, right, your point about how do you look at the communications or the press releases, for example, compared with the decisions. And I don't even know the answer to this, and I'd be curious if you do at the FCC level. You know, there's like the big policy decisions that have to get communicated, or the big staff changes, etc. But when it's about negative stuff, like the issuing of fines, or the things that happen, they have to happen, but aren't necessarily the things, you know, you don't put a press release out because you're excited and proud about it. It just kind of, it's public information, but you don't promote it because it's just, you know, something that's a part of the process. And maybe it is something that's communicated. I don't know, and I'm sure that will come out in your survey. What kinds of information are they communicating more likely than others? But then that question of what's not communicated, and there are certain kinds of decisions that they're public, maybe they're transparent, but they're not, you know, put out there.
That's actually a very good point, and this comes back to what you said, of course. And but this could be quite interesting to do a comparison also of their decisions and their press releases to see. Not to go on the level of content analysis. I mean, you can do this just by looking at the titles of what's there, and that could be quite interesting to see what's not communicated. And by that, I could also counter the criticism that we have to look at the decisions and not just at the communication. So, yeah, I definitely will look into this.
Any final? The only thing I was going to throw out before just thanking you, one thing I was thinking of when you mentioned the website and the blog, the current head of International for Ofcom actually got involved with Ofcom because she started Ofcom Watch, which was a blog that was started to track the whole process when they were converging all the different agencies, because they were quite concerned about independence and transparency and all these issues. So she started out as a critic and then has definitely switched positions. And the other thing that I think is also so interesting about this goes back to maybe something Ava mentioned about both how do you look comparatively across countries and are there regional trends that evolve? Are there kinds of communication that get communicated more than others? But then also that piece about how the different sectors interlap, because I think that's one of the things that, especially at the level of policy studies, we can get a little stuck in our buckets, if you will. And I'll be very interested to see how that matches out when you know how that compares across these other sectors. Thank you so much for coming, for laying out a really interesting framework and methods and a whole context for thinking about it, and for listening to our multiple ideas on all the stuff we want to see.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.